We just finished our second session of the online training, How to Become the Best Critical Thinker in Your Workplace. And we received some great questions that I want to take a little bit of time to answer now. If you're just tuning in, I'm Matt Plummer, the CEO of Zarvana. Thanks so much for watching this video. So let's jump into the first question, which was, we were talking about the power of ownership and how part of that and cultivating that in your team or your workplace is giving those who are doing the work decision-making authority over that work. Not necessarily all of it, but at least an element of decision-making authority. And someone asked, well, what if you're not in a position of authority in your workplace and your workplace isn't super big on giving people on the front line or lower down decision-making authority? What do you do then to cultivate that sense of ownership and to honestly get some of the decision-making authority? Here, I want to give you two things to think about. The first is that there's always an element of your work that is within your locus of control. So, for example, think about if you were assigned, if your supervisor said, okay, here's a task, I want you to do it and bring it back to me in 2 weeks. So here are a few things that you can think about that are within your control. If this task is made up of 4 subtasks, then you get to decide, the order in which you do those, when you're going to complete each one. You might get to decide the format in which you present it to your supervisor. You might get to decide, how much depth you go into on this and how much depth you go into there. So there's elements of that work that are within your control. The thing is, most of the time, we don't even think about those as being in our control. We kind of just go through the motions and feel like we're kind of like a cog in a machine. We're just churning out the work that's expected of us. But what I would say is think intentionally about what is in your control and make intentional decisions on those. And that will empower you and say, oh, actually, I am making decisions there. So that's an element of it. Obviously, that's not going to solve everything, but that will help you begin to, one, exercise your decision-making skills in a more intentional way and also cultivate a sense of ownership within you. The other way is to actually influence those around you. And one of the best ways to do that is to serve them well, to add value to them. So start this by figuring out what is it that they need? What are their pain points or challenges? So try to be perceptive of that. Usually we think, oh, our manager or boss is trying to figure out how to help us. But if you can flip the table on that and figure out how can I help them and add value to them, then that changes the nature of your relationship with them. One of the easiest ways is that most managers today are overwhelmed, too busy, have way too much to do in the time that they can do. And so if you can take things off of their plate and do them with excellence so that they don't have to spend a lot of time on it, that saves, them a lot of time, adds value to them, and it begins to change how they look at you. And so one example of that is, what I would do is, say I was in my last job where I was working with a partner on a case, and we would have a client meeting coming up, just not a huge meeting, but just a quick call. And I knew he was going to be leading the call, and I also knew that we had to think about what are we going to cover in that. And so before he would share with me what he thought we were going to cover, I would just send a quick email and say, hey, you might be thinking about this already, you might have already figured it out, but just thought I would share a quick thought on what the agenda of that meeting should be. Now, it wasn't something I was asked to do, right? Because, we're talking about the scenario in which you're not asked to make those types of decisions. But it was something that I knew had to be done, that I knew he was going to have to do, or she was going to have to do. And it was something that I knew could take a little time off of their plate. And inevitably, what happened is, one, the partner was like, oh, this is great. Just send it on to the client, let them know that we're going to be talking about those. And also then, early on, I wasn't being asked to do it. I just did it because it was a relatively low risk task, if it didn't take a huge amount of time. But then what happened is that then the partner would begin to ask me to do it. Oh, hey, Matt, can you just create the agenda for this upcoming meeting? Because he saw that I was capable of doing it. And so that's one way, is look for those ways to take things off of their plate that are, it's not huge, because if you spend a whole bunch of time on something, there's a chance that they totally discard it, and then they'll be upset with you if you're spending a whole bunch of time. But things that are relatively small, relatively low risk, and that you can do and just offer as value to them. So those are kind of the two different sides of the coin of how to increase your sense of ownership and decision-making authority within a workplace where that's not really welcome or accepted. Let's see. Okay, second question here was, we talked about problem solving as being one of the skills of phase 4, generate. How do you come up with an answer to a problem? And someone asked, what is a framework for problem solving? So here I would say two things. One is your framework might be industry or context specific. So if you think of, for example, a emergency room doctor, when someone comes in and they're trying to diagnose that situation, like what is the problem with this patient, they have a series of steps or protocols that they go through to check because they have a framework in their mind of what the different types of problems it might be based on the symptoms that they're seeing. And so in any different context or workplace, you should either have that or you either have it or you should have it. And so think about your unique context and say, is there a framework we can think about where it's like, okay, here are the symptoms that we're seeing of problems. And if we see this symptom combined with this symptom, that means it's typically this problem. And develop a context specific or industry specific problem solving framework. Beyond that, what I would say is you want to think carefully about symptoms versus causes. Here we often get these confused, and often we end up treating the symptoms rather than the root cause. And when we do that, we're not taking the power from this problem out of our situation. So it continues to go. And in fact, we might even make it worse. And so one of the ways to get at this is, what some people call the 5 whys strategy. And here they say, so say for example, you're in a distribution center and, around 3 p.m. every afternoon, the conveyor belt goes down. So the 5 why strategy, which is really trying to get beneath the symptoms into the root cause, is to say, okay, why does the conveyor go down at 3 p.m. every day? That would be the first why. Then let's say that the answer is, there's too many packages or whatever is being distributed on the conveyor at that time. Then you would say, well, why are there too many items on the conveyor at 3 p.m.? And then you might say, well, that's when we decided to ship the most orders. And then you might say, well, why did we decide to ship the most orders then? And then you might say, okay, well, that's because that's when we have both our morning shift staff and our afternoon shift staff on full capacity. And so we have the most people at that point. And then you might say, well, why do we have both shift capacities overlapping at 3 p.m.? And so you get the idea of what you're trying to do is unravel the layers of a problem so that you can get down to what is at the root of that's actually causing it. And so not necessarily a framework, but it's a process for uncovering and getting to the root cause. So that might be helpful in problem solving. All right, let's look at the next question. So a similar question to the first one is, we talked about the value and results from what researchers have called a commitment culture. There was this amazing research done, highlighted by Charles Duhigg in Smarter, Faster, Better, around startups and what cultures created the most long-term results. And here what was found was that a commitment culture, one in which the leadership would demonstrate a commitment to the people in spite of, tough external circumstances. Like even when most companies would have let people go, they reduced leadership salaries or, did other things so that they didn't have to let people go. When things got hard, they would send an email or text and say, hey, I know this is tough. Let's band together. We can get through this. And those cultures created much better results over the long run than some of the other cultures. And so someone asked, how can you, if you're not necessarily in leadership, begin to create a commitment culture? And here, let's be honest with, the power that you have. If leadership is, on the other end of the spectrum, you are going to be, face some limitations in that. So I don't want to say like, oh yeah, just do this and it will change everything. But here, obviously the first thing to do when you're talking about creating culture is to model it. if you're not modeling the culture yourself, then that's starting the wrong place. So you want to cultivate that culture inside of you first, in order to then cultivate it around you. And so are you doing things like looking out for your employees' backs, jumping in and being a team player when someone needs help, valuing people over outcomes? And so those are some of the elements of a commitment culture. And so I would say start there and even model those for leadership. And they'll, be on the benefit, on the receiving end of the benefit of that. And then they'll start to reciprocate it. And ultimately, any other change management process, you can begin to think about, how can I set up like a little experiment or a pilot where I demonstrate the value of this change? And so that might be a way to, depending on the nature of your workplace, a way to think about it. Okay. Someone asked, how do we deal with FOMO, so the fear of missing out? And I think this was in the context of some conversation around being focused and limiting, in a sense, the amount of information that you're consuming. And so here's what I'd say is the problem with social engagement at work, by which I mean like talking to a bunch of coworkers, is when it is interrupting us or when it is kind of consuming us. And so the problem is not talking with coworkers. In fact, that's a great thing. Research shows that those who say they have a best friend at work are more productive than those who don't. Obviously, connection and collaboration can increase group creativity and problem-solving ability. So the problem isn't engaging with coworkers. The problem becomes when it's not intentionally done. And so rather than randomly or haphazardly engaging with coworkers, what I would say is, okay, be intentional about how you're going to do that. And so that can be on an individual level. So saying, okay, this person, I want to connect with them on a monthly basis. So let me schedule a 30-minute coffee chat or an hour-long lunch with them on a monthly basis. So then I know I'm going to be engaging with them, so that when they're walking by, I don't feel like I have to be like, oh, what are you talking about? What's going on? Because I know I'm going to be talking to them in another week or two. You can also do that on a more corporate or group level. So you can say, okay, 2 days a week, I'm going to go into the dining hall and I'm going to sit there and eat lunch with everybody and engage in that conversation. Again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make your engagement with other people intentional rather than having it just happen and upend your priorities. So that's a key way to help satisfy that desire of like knowing what's going on without ruining your productivity. Let's see. The next question, somewhat of a similar question, but in a different way, is how do you deal with information overload? Here, what I would just say quickly is I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review probably a year and a half ago or so, talking about becoming a more productive learner. And there shared 4 strategies. And one of the things, just as context, as you said, that people today are consuming 5 times the amount of information in a day that they did back in the 1980s. And so obviously a huge challenge. How do we make sense of this information? So here are a few strategies. One is think about focusing your information consumption on a specific topic for 3 to 6 months. And so that doesn't mean that all information you consume has to be on the same topic, but maybe 80% of it is. So for example, a few months ago, I said, I'm going to go deep on habits. And so I read, in succession, several books on habits. What I was reading online in article format was about habits. And what that does is it allows you to build on the information that you're consuming. So it's not like scattershot, little piece here, a little piece there, a little piece there, but you actually build, and you do what the second tip would be, is create frameworks out of the information that you're consuming. Frameworks are a way of structuring information. It's kind of, the example I like to use is that it's kind of like you have a house. It's like building the rooms in the house so that okay, that piece of information that I just read goes in that room. And, that's a lot easier. Think about the difference between if I were to say, find a paperclip in your house, and by the way, it's in this room, versus here's a huge warehouse, no rooms, just big open space. Find the paperclip there. You get the idea that creating frameworks helps us retrieve information and understand the relationships between different pieces of information much more quickly. The third piece, which has to do with the second phase of the critical thinking roadmap, is to synthesize regularly. And what that means is actually pull up from information consumption and take time to make sense of it. What does this all mean for me? What are the key takeaways here? And so, for example, if I'm reading a book, I'm going to do that after every chapter. I'm going to try, without looking back at the chapter, say, okay, what were the key points here? What do I want to take from this? And then I'll go back and review it and, embellish and enhance my answer to that. But I'm practicing synthesis after every chapter to ensure that I'm actually making sense of the information I'm consuming. The last tip here is what I call balancing between seasons of information feasting and information fasting. And so the big problem with information overload is that we consume so much information that we think, oh, I'm a much better person because of this, when actually the only way to become a better person is to allow that information to change our behaviors. And that is where application comes in. But if I'm always feasting on information, then I'm not giving myself space or time to actually apply things. And so you want to take seasons where, okay, I'm going to spend the next 3 months and I'm going to focus on learning about habits. And then I'm going to take 3 months and I'm going to focus on applying that knowledge with these specific areas and see what works, what doesn't, where do I have problems, where else do I need to learn? And that is going to make a huge difference for you and take you out of this realm of just, I'm just consuming a lot of information, but my life stays the same. So let's see. We have one more question here, which was someone asked, when we're in the execute phase 1, which is about how do I translate instructions into action and do what I'm asked to do. Someone asked, how do you determine kind of the boundaries of how much context to provide? And, as I asked that, I was kind of thinking about it from 2 different angles. One is if I'm a manager and I'm basically delegating work to someone else, how do I think about what to share when I'm delegating? And then the other angle is if I'm the person doing the work, I'm executing, then how do I think about how much context to share when I'm presenting my work back to my supervisor? So if we look at the first from the perspective of the manager, what I would say is that when we think about delegating, there's 3 types of information that you're going to delegate. That you're going to share. So the first is the why. So why are we doing this work? The second is the what. So what is the work itself? And then the third is the how. How do you actually do the work? And so this, let me just caveat this. I'm not necessarily answering specifically, how much context to provide, but I'm kind of trying to build the understanding of like, what information do you provide? And that will help kind of understand what context to share. So again, you have the why, the what, and the how. If someone is brand new to the work or has no experience doing this work or hasn't been performing well, then you want to share all 3 of those and you want to go deep on the how. You want to be very explicit. Like, this is what you do, then after you do that, you do this. This should take an hour, then do this, and you're laying it all out. As someone gets both more experienced and is performing better, then you pull back on the how to eventually the point where you're not sharing the how. You just say, okay, here's what we need to do. Here's why we need to do this. I need this in 2 months. And they figure out the how. Then, and that's going to be, you're going to have a bunch of people who you're sharing the how with. And then hopefully you'll have people who you're not sharing the how with, but you're sharing the why and the what. And then the third group, is it's going to be more limited. But these are people where you can say, hey, this is what's going on. We need to find a solution to this. And you're not even sharing the what, like you're not telling them what to do. You're just sharing the why, like the vision, like we're trying to expand, and they actually come up with the what. They translate vision or a problem into an answer or into action. And so that's a third category where you're just sharing the why. And so look out for those people. They're going to be on the upper end of performance potential. But that's one way to think about it in terms of how much are you sharing. Ultimately, you can also just calibrate this with the person. You can say, does that make sense? Would anything else be helpful here? And kind of see where you are in that. The other thing to think about is think about it from their perspective. of like, if I were them, what information would I want to know? In general, I'd say that it would be better to start by oversharing context. And one just really interesting data point here is that they looked at in one research, they looked at when doctors were referring a patient to a specialty provider. What they found is that when they referred them, most of them were not including the primary reason for the referral in that referral transmission. And then only about 50% of the specialty providers actually shared back the results with the primary physician. And so that creates all kinds of problems of like, you're not sharing the why in that situation. And so that obviously is a problem. So I'd say start by oversharing and then recalibrate backwards as needed. From the perspective of you're doing the work that you've been assigned, you're executing on that, what I would say is you want to first do something that I would call, and that we called in my last workplace, answer first communication. What that means is that you want to share the most important insight, the answer to the question on the person's mind first, and you want to share it succinctly and clearly. And then after that, you kind of give as much information as they are interested in. And so, rather than, a lot of people say, okay, yeah, the last 2 weeks I was working on this. First I ran the numbers, then I did this. And the person who you're presenting to is sitting there being like, well, what's the answer? Like, the process doesn't matter at this point, unless that's what the question was. It doesn't matter at this point. So share the answer. We need to grow by 10% over the next 3 years to hit those goals. And then then start describing the process and the key assumptions that you had. And what I would say is start sharing there and say, I'm happy to explain more if that would be helpful. So you want to be focused, you want to be answer first, and then let people ask you more rather than oversharing and sharing a bunch of details, getting people lost or uninterested, honestly. So those are some great questions that we received. Obviously, each one of those you could spend a whole bunch more time on, but hopefully that helps you go to the next level in your exploration of that. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, please like it below, share it with someone that you think it would be helpful to, and subscribe to this channel. So thanks again for watching.